Hey everybody, it's Mike from the Mike Wagner Show, powered by Sonic Web Studios and brought to you by official sponsor of the Mike Wagner Show, international award-winning author Mia Molson's The Missing, available on Amazon and paperback and ebook. We're here with a terrific gentleman who's an author professor of Department of Latin America and Latinx Studies at John Jay College of City in New York. He was born in Havana, Cuba, and emigrated to U.S. Back in the 60s. He's currently living in Miami as well. He settled in Miami, graduated from the University of Miami in sociology, anthropology, and served at Florida International University for 12 years. And he also has a book out which tells a multicultural generational story that's distinctly Cuban and relative to the immigrant families with everywhere who you come in for survival as well of democracy, and of course relays tales of two officers who fought against the Spanish for Cuban independence. Also, families divided, orphans end up getting a mass fortune, going from rags to riches, fatal love triangles, and more. A lot of stories about Cuba. It's in a book called The House on G Street, a Cuban Family Saga. Live, ladies and gentlemen, in Plus Studios in beautiful downtown Miami, the amazing author and professor of Latin America and Latinx Studies at John Jay College, City, New York, with the book The House on G Street, a Cuban Family Saga. Ladies and gentlemen, the multi-talented Lisandro Perez. Lisandro, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thanks for joining us today.
Well, thank you for that great introduction. I'm very excited to talk to you about the book.
Well, it's great to have you on as well, too. And I wish I had a Cuban cigar and some rum right now. So
that can be arranged, I think.
I'm sure, have a virtual assistant, AI, Chat GPT, come and do that. I mean, that'd be great. So before we place the order, you're an author, professor in Department of Latin America and Latinx Studies at John Jay College, City, New York. You were born in Havana, Cuba, and you emigrated to U.S. with your parents back in the 60s. You settled in Miami, graduated from University of Miami, and also served at Florida International University for 12 years. And your book tells a multicultural generational story that distinctly Cuban and relative to immigrant families with everyone who involved, survival democracy, and just has all kinds of tales in the book, The House on G Street, a Cuban Family Saga. And before getting all this, Sandro, tell us how you first got started.
Well, actually, this book, I think I got started when I was fairly young. One of the most of the material that I have in this book, I've really been gathering it all my life. I was always very attentive, sort of quiet child, and I listened to what my grandparents had to say. I listened to their stories. I actually encouraged them to tell me stories. So you can say I've been gathering material for this book my entire life. Of course, I became a sociologist and a researcher and a historian. So I started also not only depending on those family stories, but also doing some research that sort of filled out those stories. And so the book is actually rests on a combination of sources, those family stories, photographs that I have of the family, and then of Cuban history and research into Cuban history, because I thought it was important to put those family stories in the context of Cuban history. So this is a book about Cuban history with a family story in it, or maybe it's a family story with Cuban history in it, but that's what it's about.
But either way, it's really good entertainment material. And of course, I've been fascinated by it for quite some time as well. And was it one precise moment that simply influenced you into writing a book or what you're doing? What was that one precise moment that simply said, this is what I'm going to do? It's like a light bulb going off.
Well, my previous book that I wrote was on Cuban families in New York City in the 19th century. I thought that, most of my research is on the Cuban American community. I usually studied the contemporary community, but this was the 19th century community that I decided to study. And I told the stories of a lot of those families. And then I said to myself, my family has also pretty interesting stories, and I've accumulated them all my life. And I think I want to leave that for my children, my grandchildren. But at the same time, I want to write a book about Cuban history. So that's when the light bulb went out that I said, I really ought to put this down in writing, all of these stories that I've gathered, and if those families were very interesting, they were not my families, but now I was writing about my family, and I thought they were equally interesting.
Well, it's also interesting, too, that you were born in La Habana, Cuba, and you emigrated to U.S., your parents, going back to 1960. And that was quite a story right there.
Well, yes. I mean, this was 2 years into the revolution. Revolution takes place in January 1st, 1959, which is when Fidel Castro rises to power. and we did not leave. We left in October of 1960. I would say that 1959 was still, life was pretty normal in many ways. But in 1960, things started changing very rapidly. And it's not that my family had a lot of, property or things. A lot of people left because they lost property or they were threatened politically. That was not the case with my family. I think my father and many of his brothers and sisters, he had 9 brothers and sisters,
Hmm.
um, he realized that Cuba was going to change in ways that he found very threatening. And I think ultimately he was right. I mean, I think it would have been a world that would have been very hard for him and for my mother to adjust to. So we left for the United States. There was also the idea that we weren't leaving permanently because, the U.S. was not going to allow this to happen. That is, it wasn't going to allow in the middle of the Cold War for a pro-Soviet ally to arise 90 miles from the United States. There's certainly a lot of history in which the U.S. prevented those things from happening in Latin America. So it wasn't for lack of trying, of course. If we go back to the Bay of Pigs and many efforts of the U.S. to overthrow the Cuban government, but the fact is that it turned out to be permanent, and so that was what more than 60 years ago, and we haven't gone back. I've gone back. Most of my family has not, but I've gone back to Cuba very quite often, actually, starting in 1979.
And do you think Cuba will ever go back to its pre 1959, pre Fidel Castro?
Oh, I don't think so. I think it may be that there will be a bit more, let's say, capitalism or free market and so forth. But I think, for one thing, the social class that in many ways my parents belonged to, and that was threatened by the Cuban Revolution. I think that social class, of course, in many ways disappeared. It moved to Miami. It didn't disappear. It moved to Miami, actually. And it's here in Miami. But I don't think Cuba is going to ever be the same as it was. And that's not a bad thing, I might add, because, there were a lot of things that did not go right with the Cuba before 1959 either, which is why there was a revolution.
How so? That's interesting because I get people asking me about that. Was it better off with or without Castro, and what was really like back in 1959,
Well,
economic wise, political, social,
yeah.
and everything else before Castro took over?
Right. I think that you have to look at it in terms of, whose Cuba was it? For members of the social class that my parents belonged to, of course, the revolution and a socialist system that would come in and take away private enterprise and replace it with a one-party system and whatever was terrible news, and they left, right? But again, Cuba was a country in which, yes, the Havana was a wonderful place in the sense that it was flush with American automobiles. It was a cosmopolitan city. But, Cuba in 1958 was ruled by a military ruler unconstitutionally. It had an impoverished peasantry, and they had these contradictions. So I think that's what made revolution possible in Cuba. And so I don't think I'd want to go back to that era, even though, again, it's an era that I'm nostalgic for because of my childhood. But I think Cuba, I hope, moves forward and becomes a kind of nation where again there's justice and there's people can sort of live out their dreams in many ways. I think that's one of the problems with Cuba today, is that the state doesn't allow a lot of freedom, economic freedom and so forth. So that's something to think about.
And of course, you talk about the military rule back, before 1958. It had the military rule long before that, even when Cuba first got established.
Yes. Well, the Cuban Republic, which came into being in 1902, when the U.S. left Cuba and essentially turned Cuba over to a Cuban government, it had a lot of ups and downs. There were a number of democratically elected presidents, but there were also dictators as well. There was one like between 1925 and 1933. And then, of course, Fulgencio Batista came in with a coup in 1952, in which he disrupted also a democratic constitutional order and just installed himself as the military ruler just because he could. He had the support of the military. So he was, in that sense, a dictator. He was not constitutionally elected, and I think that's the kind of situation that gives rise, to a revolution. I mean, it happened in Mexico as well. The
Hmm.
Mexican Revolution of 1910 was a reaction to the uh, Porfiriato, or the rule of Porfirio Diaz. So usually, when you have dictators, you sometimes have revolutions.
And it does too. That you also had a strong American influence, especially a young child as well. You kind of get that presence too, and benefits, contradictions, and everything else. So it's just kind of like, how'd you manage to handle it? Birational
Well,
world.
Well, yeah, I grew up in a binational world, and the 1950s were, one Cuban novelist described it as those American years, because this is when American influence in Cuba really reached a kind of a crescendo, a climax, if you will, and you had a lot of influence of the U.S. I went. My father and mother wanted me to learn English. It was important that I learn English because he, that is my father, had gone to a school in the United States. His father put him in a boarding school in Long Island,
Mm,
and he learned English, and he saw the value of learning English in Cuba. So he put me essentially in an American school in Havana, that had about half of the students, more than half of the students were Americans, and another half were Cuban students like myself, whose parents wanted us to learn English. And we had, the day was split. The morning was in English. We had American history, we had spelling, we had, all the American subjects, even in arithmetic was in English.
mm.
And then in the afternoon, we had classes in Spanish, Cuban history, Cuban geography, Spanish grammar, and so forth. So it was this binational world that I lived in. And again, the influence of the U.S. was very great. We, of course, went to see a lot of American movies. It was a very much. I think it's very difficult for Americans today, given the the distance and the hostility between the U.S. and Cuba, to actually, realize that back then, there were very few countries that were as close as the U.S. and Cuba, and that there was this tremendous influence of the U.S. and Cuba. And part of what my book does is talk from a child's perspective about how I lived that sort of binationality, that sort of American and Cuban world. And I think a lot of Americans just don't realize just how American Cuba was, given now how how many ways distant are the relations.
You talked about going to see American movies in Miami. You were growing up. How about the entertainment in Cuba compared to America as well, like the movies, the music, and literature, and everything else?
Yeah, well, Cuba had a very vibrant culture. I mean, and so, particularly in literature, in the arts, and so forth. The movie or film industry was not as developed in Cuba. We tended to watch American movies. There were some Cuban movies that had been made at that time, but certainly in terms of literature and the arts, Cuba experienced a real explosion in the 1930s, and the 40s, and 50s, as sort of consumer trends increased and so forth. There was also a market for art. It was a very vibrant place. Havana was just a very vibrant place.
And certainly as well too. And of course, speaking of authors, you also wrote your book. You talk about your numerous families. A lot of things are going on. Like two officers fighting against the Spanish for Cuban independence, families divided, and a lot more. Even a fatal love triangle. Find out more with the House on G Street, a Cuban Family Saga with Lisandro Perez. But first, listen to the Mike Wagner Show at the MikeWagnerShow.com, powered by SoundCloud Studios. Visit online at SoundCloudStudios.com for all your needs. Looking at a professional website without breaking your budget, Sonic Web Studios is the answer. Sonic Web Studios offers fast, affordable custom web designs that blow the competition away. Call today, 1-800-303-3960. That's 1-800-303-3960, or email to support@sonicwebstudios.com. Mention the Mike Wagner Show, get 20% off your first project. Sonic Web Studios, take your image to the next level. Also, time to give an official shout out to our official sponsor of the Mike Wagner Show, international warring author Mia Molson-Zia. If you love fast-paced mysteries, you'll love Missing by Mia Molson-Zia, available on Amazon and paperback and ebook. Missing is fast-paced and intriguing with an unforgettable twist. Takes place in 4 countries, 2 strangers, 1 target, where truth is illusion and those who love be the first go missing. It's available on Amazon and paperback and ebook. Missing by Mia Molson Zia's garnered great reviews. And Evil Evan enjoys by Howard celebrities, including Jordan Cassidy, Forbes Riley, and many others. So grab your copy today before it goes missing by Mia Molson Zia, available on Amazon. Also, check out The Mike Wagner Show at themikewagnershow.com and our 40 podcast platforms. Heard in 100 countries, including Facebook, SoundCloud, Spreaker, Spotify, and iHeartRadio. Also, Apple Music, Odyssey, BitChute, Rumble, YouTube, Pandora, Podbean, and follow us on LinkedIn, Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Facebook, and more, and take us with you on any mobile device. And for great gift ideas, go to Amazon.com. Check out the Mike Wagner Show podcast, t-shirts, pop sockets, throw pillows, tote bags, hoodies. Makes great gifts 24/7 year round. Go to Amazon.com. Check out the Mike Wagner Show podcast. And for more great gift ideas, go to Amazon.com/me and Molson Zia for great books like Misting, Once, and Wrinkles, plus t-shirts, pop sockets, hoodies, phone cases, and more. Amazon.com/me and Molson Zia. Check it out today and support the Mike Wagner Show on Anchor FM, PayPal, and the MikeWagnerShow.com. We're here with author and professor of Department of Latin American and Latinx Studies at John Jay College of City, New York. Lisandro Perez here on the Mike Wagner Show with the book, The House on G Street, A Cuban Family Saga. And before I talk more about the book, you also had a previous one we covered just a bit, maybe a bit more in detail. Sugar, Cigars, and Revolution, the making of Cuban New York. Tell us a bit about that.
Well, I most of my career has been devoted to studying the Cuban presence in the United States, and I was for many years on the faculty at Florida International University here in Miami, and so I studied the contemporary Cuban American community. But I always felt that we didn't know enough about the history of Cuban Americans in the United States. We knew quite a bit about the Florida cigar making communities, Ybor City and Key West, which were important Florida cigar making communities. But I always thought that New York was really the most important 19th century community, and there had been very little research done on it. So I dove right in. I'm a sociologist, but I sort of became a historian, and I was fortunate enough to get a grant, actually a fellowship, a residential fellowship at the New York Public Library. That brought me into contact with a lot of sources, archives, and I discovered all these Cubans who lived in New York in the 19th century. And not only that they were very important in Cuban history. For example, there were connections very early, I'm talking 1820s, between Cuba and New York, because a lot of Cuban sugar that was being produced at that time, and there was a big sugar boom. A lot of sugar that was produced at that time was actually sold in New York. It was shipped to New York. And so there was this relationship that developed between Cuban ports and New York, and a lot of not only a traffic of sugar and also cigars, but also a traffic in people, of course, that came back and forth. And a lot of the elites in Cuba at the time, particularly the sugar plantation owners, they had, in many cases, homes in New York, and they traveled back and forth to New York. So, and it was in New York that a lot of the independence movements got started. The annexationists, for example, were in New York. They tried to annex Cuba to the U.S. That failed with the Civil War. But then thereafter, there were the independence movements, and in 1870 was the year in which I think the Cuban community in New York reached its height. And I have the stories there of many of the families and many of their activities for getting rid of Spanish colonialism. Because, of course, during all this time, Cuba is a Spanish colony, and it didn't gain its independence really until the U.S. leaves in 1902. So Cuba was very late with its independence. And this is the story of the Cubans who lived in New York up until like 1898. I don't go into the 20th century.
And how did Cuba get its independence? So what was that one event that got to a point where Cuba got its independence in 1902?
Well, of course, what happened is that the Cubans initiated a war. Actually, it was started in New York. Jose Marti, who has a big statue in New York City in Central Park, was the founder of the Cuban independence movement. He started organizing everything from New York, finally launched everything in 1895. He's actually killed in a Cuban battlefield in May of 1895, but the war continues. And as we know, which is part of U.S. history, the U.S. enters the war in 1898. And it was what the Secretary of State at the time called a splendid little war, because it didn't last very long. The U.S., of course, won that war, especially because it defeated Spain in the oceans, and it was primarily a naval victory. Once Spain lost its navy, it was not able to conduct a war against the U.S. especially. So it was a very short war. But as a result of that, the U.S. took over Cuba and Puerto Rico and
Wow.
the Philippines, which were, of course, previously Spanish colonies. And what it decided to do, it governed Cuba from 1899 until 1902. And I have quite a bit of that in the book on the House on G Street, because my great grandfather on my mother's side actually worked for that U.S. government. He was also educated in the U.S. and he knew English and he knew accounting. So he was a principal figure in the auditor's office for that government. So I have quite a bit about the U.S. governing Cuba from 1899 to 1902. Then the U.S. decided to just turn over, the governing of Cuba to a Cuban government. They did it with some strings attached, which was called the Platt Amendment. But that's how Cuba became independent. There's some Cuban historians who say that even in 1902, Cuba was not independent because it had quite a bit of control coming from Washington, and it wasn't really independent in making a lot of decisions. But anyway, that's when it actually has a government.
Mm-hmm. You also talk having a number of Cubans in Miami and New York. What are some of the other popular Cuban locations around the U.S. besides Miami and New York?
Well, historically, of course, Key West and Tampa. In Tampa, you had in 1886, you had the creation of a cigar making community that was totally initiated by Cuban cigar makers from Cuba who built their factories there. They built housing for the workers, and that by the 1890s, Ybor City, which was named after Vicente Martinez Ybor, who was the cigar maker who started the project, that was the largest Cuban community at that time. Then, of course, New York took over again. And then finally, when the Cuban Revolution comes in 1959, of course, Miami is the principal community for Cubans. There's also some other prominent communities still in New York, some in Los Angeles. And recently, for reasons that are not entirely, understood, there's been a large nucleus of Cubans in Louisville, Kentucky.
Really? Louisville, Kentucky, of
yes,
all places? I can't imagine that.
I don't know. I think it has to do a lot of the, what happens sometimes with migration is when a lot of people get settled in a place, then other people follow. And for some reason, they found opportunity. These are more recent arrivals, right? People who have arrived within the past 10 or 15 years, they have found, by apparently, a home in Louisville.
Wow, that is interesting. And it sure wasn't horse racing, was it?
Oh, I don't know. It could be. For all I know, there was in the 1960s, there was a rather large Cuban community in Las Vegas, and part of it is that, of course, Cuba had a lot of casinos prior to the revolution. When the revolution came in, they outlawed gambling. So all the people, croupiers, and all those guys who run, the gambling tables and whatever, were out of a job, and they went to Las Vegas.
That makes sense. I think that's a great story right there too. And of course, speaking of great stories, and one of them, talks about two officers who fought against the Spanish for Cuban independence. I think that was covered. If you want to talk more about that's fine. Families divide as well too, and you also got some people went from rags to riches. That's a really good story.
Yes, I think that's in many ways one of the more interesting stories, because I think what part of what is also always said about the Cuban part of what is said about the Cuban Republic is that it was a very closed, it was an elite that was very closed. But there's the story of my grandfather, who, by the way, had the same name. I was named after him. I was named after my father, who was named after him. My grandfather, my paternal grandfather, was an orphan boy from central Cuba who developed a very prosperous business exporting leaf tobacco to the United States. So he became a kind of an expert in the quality of tobacco leaves, and he developed a very strong set of tobacco farmers who sold to him their crops, and he then processed those leaves. Actually, that process would take up to 7 years sometimes.
Wow, 7 years. I
Leaves.
wanted that cigar now. Now I know why. They're so
Right.
good.
and the leaves were. I have an entire chapter in this book in which I detail this process, because the leaves had to be matured. They had to be fermented. They had to be stemmed. You have to remove the middle rib and so forth. They had to be in storage under humid conditions for a long time. And then finally they were shipped to the U.S. And he became the sole exporter for the General Cigar Company. The General Cigar Company in New York, which had its facilities in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. And he was their provider of Cuban tobacco for cigars that were manufactured in Pennsylvania. And so he made quite a bit of money, and he did it with a lot of hard work and a lot of developing an expertise in personal relations in the tobacco world in Cuba. And that's a story that I was very proud to tell, because I think that was a story that, he always avoided politics. He never got into politics or anything. There were a lot of people in Cuba who did very well financially and who tried to avoid politics, because once you get involved in politics, it becomes a very risky proposition. He actually had an offer from the president in 1928 to run for the Senate. And he said, no, I don't think so. And it was a good decision, because that president became very unpopular. Wow. And when he was finally thrown out of power, people turned upon those who were his supporters. But of course, he stayed at the margins of that. So that's a story about my paternal grandfather. The officers who fought in the Cuban War of Independence were two. One was my great grandfather on my mother's side, who did fight in the Cuban War of Independence. He rose to the rank of colonel, and he became the chief auditor for the Cuban government in arms. And later on, he became the chief auditor for the Cuban Republic. This is the one who worked for the U.S. provisional government as well. So he was a rather prominent historical figure. The other officer who fought for Cuban independence was the uncle of my paternal grandmother. And he was also very prominent. He rose to be colonel, and he was killed in trying to launch an assault on the main garrison in the city called Santa Clara. And today, the Central Park in Santa Clara, which is a principal Cuban city in central Cuba, bears his name. It's named after him, Leoncio Vidal, and there's a bust of him on the park. I've taken my picture several times with the bust. So one of the reasons I decided to write this book is not just, to write about my family, but because I thought they were interesting stories. These stories that I've inherited and that I've done research on are actually interesting, and I hope people find them interesting as well.
And they'll certainly fall in love with your stories and more. And speaking of falling in love, we'll find out what one story about it. Is it that or a triangle? We'll find out what it is with Lisandro Perez and the house on G Street, a Cuban Family Saga. You listen to The Mike Wagner Show at themikewagnershow.com, powered by SonicWeb Studios, and brought to you by official sponsor of The Mike Wagner Show, international warring author Mia Molson-Zia. We'll be back with author Lisandro Perez of the house on G Street after this time out. We're back with author Lisandro Perez of the house on G Street, a Cuban Family Saga here on the Mike Wagner Show. And of course, there's a lot of love and passion going on in Cuba, love stories and everything else, but also there's love triangles as well. A fatal one too, especially.
Yes, this is a story that I have in the book. I thought a lot about including it or not, but I thought it would, not only was it a good story, but it actually explains a lot. And I only learned the story. I did not learn the story as a child. I only learned the story after my father died. It involves my father, and I only learned of it after he died, because his brothers told me about it, and everyone in the town in Camajuani. Camajuani is the town where his father had most of his business. It turns out that my grandfather hired his son to run a business in this town in central Cuba. And the family had already moved to Havana. So my father was living there as a young man. He had graduated from a high school in New York, but when he returned to Cuba, his father put him in charge of this business, which was a business in making chorizos, right?
Oh, wow.
And it was a plant in that town, which my grandfather bought, and then put his son, my father, in charge of that chorizo plant, in which he had to gather all this cattle and cattle and pigs and so forth, and process the meat and put it into into casings and canned them. Anyway, he loved living in that town. It was one of the happiest moments in his life. But then he ran into a very attractive older woman. He was about 24 or so. This woman was in her early 30s, very attractive, very cosmopolitan. She owned a dress shop in Camajuani in the town. Very attractive woman, great conversationalist, but she was married.
Mm.
And her husband was a house painter who they did not have any children, and he was a kind of a gruffy guy, did not like social activities. And she met my father, and they started having a relationship. And of course, this was probably something my father should not have done, but again, this was an older woman. I mean, it wasn't he was taking advantage of a younger woman or anything like that. And what happened eventually is, of course, it's a small town. Everybody learned about it,
Mm.
and the husband learned about it. And one day he walked into the bedroom where she was getting ready to go to work at her dress shop and said, "You got to, you have to end this relationship." And she said no. And he took out a gun and shot her twice, and then
Wow.
shot himself. And immediately, my uncle, uh, my great uncle, I should say, uh, when he saw this, immediately went to get my father and put him on the first train to Havana, because this woman actually had very aggressive brothers. She had a whole 3 or 4 brothers who were sort of very aggressive, and they knew that they would blame him for it. And so he couldn't go back to the town for 7 years. And
Wow.
this was the town where my grandfather has tobacco operations. It would have been a place for him to have been to work with the tobacco business, and the chorizo business. But he couldn't go back to Camajuani. His life was essentially threatened by the woman's brothers. And so I thought that was an important story because it explained a lot about why my father had to leave this town in which he had lived most of his youth and go back to Havana. He went back to Havana and met my mother eventually.
Nice. That's a great story as well. Of course, we covered about business, culture, and everything else, some of the things you own. What are some other things we all learned from the book as well?
Well, I think one of the things that's important in the book is to find out is to really see how Cuban from a micro, as I call it, a micro perspective, because doing the story of my family, but I'm tying it to Cuban history. So I think that many things that we know historically about Cuba are also explained here in a very personal level. For example, this U.S. influence in Cuba. My great grandfather on my mother's side, he worked for the Americans. He was this individual who managed some of the largest sugar mills in Cuba. And then, of course, my father's father, who developed this tobacco business, and he became eventually, the sole exporter for General Cigar. So we see that by the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, the Cuban economy becomes more and more closely associated with the U.S. And we see this in the lives of my family. And
Hmm.
that is why I go to an American school, right? That's why my father is educated in Long Island, why my mother's father is educated in New York Military Academy, why
Hmm.
his father is educated also in the Hudson Valley. That is, you get a real sense from a very personal level of how Cuba became in many ways an almost, dependency of the U.S.
Hmm.
And I think that's something that you see there very clearly
Hmm.
in the book. And
Hmm.
that's one of the things and I think also I deal a lot with the politics of the Cuban Republic, in which my great grandfather, my mother's side was involved in. And you see how really sometimes there's a tendency to blame the U.S. for all of Cuba's problems before. But we can also see how Cubans behave badly, right? In other words, political actors who engaged in a great deal of corruption, who did not have the best interests of the country at stake. All of that, I think we see. I think there are certain aspects of Cuban history that get illuminated by looking at it this way.
Hmm.
And
And,
I think in the process, I think it's a bunch of good stories as well.
and what explains the bad behavior of most of the Cubans, especially the actors? like the source of it.
I'm sorry. Yes, go ahead. I'm
The
sorry.
what explains the bad behaviors of most of the Cubans, especially the actors you talked about.
Well, I think what happened was you got to realize that when the U.S. turns over Cuba to a Cuban government in 1902, which is when most people believe that Cuban independence starts, it did so with the strings that were specified in something called the Platt Amendment. The Platt Amendment was sponsored by Senator Orville Platt of Connecticut, inserted into an Army appropriations bill in Washington, and then made part of the Cuban Constitution, as a condition for the U.S. leaving it in the hands of a Cuban government. That is, the Cubans were forced to accept this amendment. And among the things that the amendment stipulates is that the U.S. retains the right to intervene
Oh,
whenever
wow.
life and property were threatened in Cuba. It also provided other things. For example, you have now, the U.S. is still in Guantanamo Naval Base, where, as we know, they've imprisoned the enemy combatants after 9/11. If you recall,
I,
Guantanamo was.
I do remember, yeah, and they're talking about Guantanamo Bay,
Yep.
9/11, and everything else. It's almost like a what was it, Alcatraz, San Quentin, or somewhere along those lines.
Right. Well, there's a naval base there, and that naval base goes back to 1903,
Wow.
when, as a part of the Plan Amendment, Cuba was obliged to lease that property to the U.S. to set up a naval station. So all of this has history, and the part that's important is that clause that allowed the U.S. the right to intervene in Cuban affairs if life or property were threatened. Well, what happened is that what would happen in Cuba is that if you lost an election, right, you would say, maybe legitimately or illegitimately, but you would say, hey, you know, we don't really respect the results of this election, so we're going to go out and we're going to make trouble, and then the U.S. will intervene and nullify the election. So it was called, what was set up was interventionist politics. Essentially, the Platt Amendment made the U.S. the final arbiter of the Cuban political system, and the Cubans, instead of doing perhaps what was best, did what was worse, which is play that off.
Hmm.
And so it actually happened in 1906. There was so much fighting going on over the results of an election. I mean, armed fighting, that Theodore Roosevelt reluctantly said, "Okay, we'll intervene." And then from 1906 to 1909, the U.S. governed Cuba again
Oh my gosh.
directly. So what I'm saying is, it's a history that Cubans cannot be very proud of. Now, having said that, this is all in the political arena. Cuba had developed at that time a tremendous culture, I mean, the music, literature, everything, right? But politics is sort of the dismal topic.
Hmm. And how about Cuba today?
Well, what you have today, of course, is a revolution that grew out of that system, and a lot of people in 1959, when Fidel Castro rose to power, supported that revolution. My father supported it, certainly. Cubans have been calling for revolutions since 1898
Hmm.
because they wanted a system that had social justice, that had equality for everyone, inclusiveness, and especially sovereignty. For Cuba to be governed by Cubans. The Cuban Republic didn't deliver on those things, and so part of what the Cuban Revolution of 1959 promised to do was to go back to that agenda of social justice and so forth, and a lot of Cubans supported it. The thing is that for many Cubans, not for all, and maybe not for many, or uh, the reforms of that revolution went way beyond what they thought a revolution should do.
Hmm.
And for example, the turning point for my father, I think, in deciding to leave was, I mean, he didn't have any problem with the nationalization of U.S. firms. He didn't have any problem with many of the things that the revolution was espousing. But when the revolution started saying, we're going to nationalize private schools, and we're going to, instead of having private schools, all children would go to a public universal public education system. Well, that sort of signaled the notion in the Cold War that children were going to be sent to state schools, maybe even to Moscow, right? To be
Wow, Moscow of all places.
indoctrinated. Well, because Cuba was getting close to the Soviet Union.
Mm,
So in the Cold War era, there was this fear, right? This fear of communism and so forth. And so I think for my parents, I think the revolution crossed a line there, right? And that's how they felt alienated from it. Of course, if you were, a peasant family in Cuba whose child didn't had very little opportunity to go to school, then you welcomed a universal public education system.
mm-hmm,
So I'm saying is that revolution affected people differently, right?
mm,
And I think for some people it went way beyond what they thought that revolution would do.
mm. That is rather interesting. In the meantime, where can we find your book at the house on G Street?
Well, yeah, it's on Amazon. It's The House on G Street, a Cuban Family Saga. It's also on the website of New York University Press. The book is published by New York University Press, and actually, I can share with your listeners a discount code if they'd like to go to the New York University Press website. They can let me reach over here. You can get 30% off if you go to the New York University Press website and put in the code NYUP30. That's NYUP30. If you put in that code,
NYUP30.
you get a 30% discount on the book. And as it is, it's already only $32. So that's a significant discount. It's a hardback book, and it has about 45 illustrations, family photographs, and so forth. So
Okay.
again, it's NYUP30, and the website is nyupress.org.
NYUpress.org. Okay, well, I encourage everybody to go to that website, purchase the book. We're here with author Lisandro Perez at the House on G Street, a Cuban Family Saga here on the Mike Wagner Show. Just a few more minutes, Lisandro. This has been great. And what else can we expect me in 2024 and beyond?
Do you mean personally or for Cuba?
It can be anything,
Right. Well,
wherever you want.
personally, I'm looking forward to working on a more general book on Cuban Americans. I think there isn't a really good history of Cuban Americans, but let's talk about Cuba. I've become unfortunately, I've been expecting change in Cuba for a long time. And when I mean change, I don't mean like most people or most Cuban Americans think of, overthrowing the whole system or whatever. I just would like to see a Cuba that, for example, that where there's plenty of opportunity for everyone, in which Cuba is not in the newspapers, in which is just a
Wow.
country that is, because Cuba is so frequently in the newspapers for the wrong reasons.
Hmm.
And I'd like to see a Cuba in which, people are just living happily and pursuing their interests and their lives, and there isn't this hostility and isolation that it's currently living in, especially with the embargo with the United States. I'd like to see things normalized. I can imagine here in Miami, if things got normalized with Cuba, as it is already, there's a dozen flights daily, from Miami to Havana.
Wow.
The flight itself is only 40 minutes, you know.
Hmm.
So imagine if things were normalized and it were normal to go to Cuba, and Americans could go to Cuba and they could go to Cuba and buy Cuban cigars and all kinds of things like that. It would be a different world in terms of Cuba. I'd like to see that normalization, but I should say I become a pessimist about it, because there have been a lot of times in which I say, "Oh, it's going to happen now. It's going to happen now," and then it doesn't happen, right? So I've sort of become a pessimist.
Or go see the Rolling Stones in Havana. That was a first, too.
Oh, yeah, that's right. That's right. Exactly. Yeah. But it's still everything is involved in political controversy. Nora Jones was going to do a concert in Havana in I think in January, if I'm not mistaken, and they canceled it because there was so much outcry in the United States among Cuban Americans, and also because some of the things that I think she was planning on doing might have violated some of the concert might have violated the embargo. So, it's normal things at concerts can't happen. And that's a shame.
Mhm. Yes, that is. And of course, we're looking forward to more of what you got as well, too. And who do you consider your biggest influence in your career?
Oh, I'd love to talk about him. He was my major professor in my career. Of course, my family, my parents have been the major influence in my life. But in terms of my career, I had my dissertation advisor, my PhD advisor, was an individual by the name of Thomas Lynn Smith, T. Lynn Smith, and he was a sociologist. I studied under him at the University of Florida. He was the seventh son of a Mormon sheep rancher from Colorado,
Wow.
and he developed an expertise on Latin America, and he learned Spanish as well. And he taught me how to be a professor. He taught me sociology. He taught me everything I needed to do. And not only that, he recommended me for my first job, which was at Louisiana State University. That's where I had my first faculty position. So I owe T. Lynn a great debt of gratitude.
Certainly does, and it's amazing too. And what's the best advice you can give to anybody at this point?
Well, if in terms of advice to anybody, I would, if you read my book, you'll see that it's become easier to do research on one's family. The internet has made it. I mean, a lot of the family stories that I heard and that I have in this book, I was able to research them and fill them out with information that I was able to gather on the internet.
Mhm.
For example, I always heard the story that my grandparents on my mother's side had met in a party in the Upper West Side of New York.
Oh, wow.
Okay, well, I said, let me research that. If they did, they must have come in on a ship somewhere, right? My grandfather was studying at New York Military Academy. My grandmother was visiting. What ship did she arrive in? When did she arrive? All of that you can find online, and I would encourage people to look at their family stories.
I think that's a really great point, and I'll do some research on mine as well too. So we're here with the author Lisandro Perez of The House on G Street, a Cuban Family Saga here on the Mike Wagner Show. Lisandro, very big thank you for your time. You've been absolutely fantastic. Learned a lot from you. Looking forward to having you soon. Keep us up to date. Keep in touch. Love to have you back. Once again, what's your website? How do people contact you? Where can people purchase or check out your works?
Well, yeah, I have a website. I'm at John Jay College, which is part of the City University of New York. If you go to the website of John Jay College, I have a faculty web page there. It has a little biography. It also has my email address, which I'll just mention it. It's LOPEREZ at jjay.cuny.edu. So, but I'm at the John Jay College website. If you look for my name, you'll find my faculty webpage, and that has all my publications and where my books have been published and a small biography as well.
We'll certainly check that out. Once again, Lisandro, very big thank you for your time. You've been absolutely amazing. Learned a lot. Looking forward to having you again soon. Keep us up to date. Keep in touch. Love to have you back. Wish you all the best. And Lisandro, you definitely have a great future ahead of you.
Great. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you for having me on my program. It's been a pleasure.